They stood on the same stage for over a decade, finished each other's sentences in interviews, and sold out arenas across 3 continents as a single act that felt, to millions of fans, inseparable. Marcus and Malcolm Reese were not just brothers. They were twins, born 11 minutes apart, who built one of the most successful music duos this country has ever seen from nothing but a church choir, a shared bedroom, and a stubborn belief that they were meant to do this together. This is part 1 of a 5-part series, and I want you to remember that word, together, because by the end of this story, it will mean something very different than it does right now. What began as the greatest partnership either of them ever had would eventually collapse, not once, but twice, over the exact same betrayal, hidden inside the exact same place, a private account neither of them was ever supposed to find. Here is what you need to know before we go further. Marcus and Malcolm built an empire together, one that made both of them wealthy beyond anything either of them imagined growing up. Their older brother Terrence managed the business side of that empire from the very beginning, handling contracts, royalties, and the money neither twin had the patience or the interest to track closely themselves. For years, that arrangement worked, or at least appeared to. What none of them could have predicted was how deep the fractures would eventually run. Fractures that would tear the group apart in a way the public only partially understood, fractures that would resurface years later during what was supposed to be a triumphant reunion, proving that some betrayals, once they take root inside a family, never fully go away. Stay with me through this series, because the full truth took years to surface, and even now, not everyone agrees on exactly how much damage was done, or who deserves to be forgiven for it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the rest of this series. Marcus and Malcolm Reese were born 11 minutes apart in Memphis, Tennessee, the youngest of 4 children in a household where music was never a hobby. It was simply how the family communicated. Their mother, Loretta Reese, directed the choir at a Baptist church on the south side of the city for over 20 years, and their father, a quiet man who worked at a freight distribution warehouse, played guitar most Sunday afternoons on the back porch, teaching whichever of his children happened to wander outside whatever chords he had learned that week. Terrence, the eldest by nearly 9 years, had already left home to pursue his own ambitions in the music business by the time the twins were old enough to remember much of their early childhood together. But he remained a constant presence in the family, someone the twins looked up to, with a kind of reverence that only grew as they got older. The Reese household sat on a modest street in a working-class neighborhood where most families knew each other by name, where the sound of the twins harmonizing through an open window on a summer evening was, according to more than one longtime neighbor, simply part of the ambient soundtrack of the block. Loretta has described in interviews how she first noticed something unusual in her youngest sons when they were barely old enough to speak in full sentences, humming melodies to each other across the room in a kind of call and response that seemed to require no coordination at all, as though the two of them were operating from the same internal instrument. She has said she used to joke with her husband that she had somehow given birth to one musician, split across 2 bodies, a joke that carried more literal truth than either of them fully appreciated at the time. Their father, Otis Reese, worked long, physically demanding shifts at the warehouse for most of the twins' childhood, and the guitar sessions on the back porch became, in Malcolm's later recollection, one of the few times he remembers his father fully relaxed, unhurried, present in a way the exhaustion of his job rarely allowed during the rest of the week. Marcus has said those Sunday afternoons taught him something about music that no formal training ever could. The idea that a song could be a form of rest, a way of setting down a burden rather than performing for anyone. A lesson he has said he spent much of his adult career trying, not always successfully, to hold on to once music became his livelihood, rather than simply his family's quiet ritual. From the time they could walk, Marcus and Malcolm were rarely seen apart. Neighbors who knew the family during those years described 2 boys who seemed to share not just a face, but an entire internal language, finishing each other's thoughts mid-sentence, drifting toward the same instruments at the same moment, without ever discussing it beforehand. Their mother has said in interviews since that she noticed their musical instinct extraordinarily early. Watching 4- and 5-year-old twins harmonize on hymns during choir rehearsal, in a way that made grown singers in the church turn their heads. By the time they were teenagers, singing together was no longer something they did occasionally. It was simply who they were, individually and as a pair, in a way that made it difficult for anyone in Memphis to imagine one of them without the other standing close by. Despite their closeness, those who knew the twins well during adolescence described two genuinely distinct personalities beneath the shared face and shared talent. Marcus was the more outwardly ambitious of the two, prone to staying up late, sketching out set lists, and imagining tour posters years before there was any tour to speak of. Someone who treated the eventual dream of a music career as an inevitability rather than a hope. Malcolm was quieter, more introspective, the one who tended to notice when a lyric rang false or a melody resolved too easily. A natural editor whose instincts, more than once, kept the two of them from releasing songs Marcus had been ready to consider finished. Friends from their teenage years have said this balance, Marcus pushing forward and Malcolm holding the line on quality, was as essential to Bloodline's eventual sound as either brother's individual talent. The two of them began performing publicly around age 15, first in church settings and local talent showcases, then increasingly in small clubs across Memphis that were willing to overlook their age in exchange for the kind of energy they brought to a room. They wrote their first original songs together in the bedroom they still shared at the time, trading verses back and forth on a second-hand keyboard their father had bought at a pawn shop, recording rough demos onto a cassette recorder, borrowed from their church's audio ministry. Malcolm has said in later interviews that those early recording sessions, cramped and technically primitive as they were, remain some of the purest creative moments of his entire career, unburdened by contracts, audiences, or money, just two brothers chasing a sound they could both hear clearly in their heads, before either of them could fully explain it to anyone else. By the time they graduated high school, local buzz around the twins had grown enough that Terrence, who by then had spent nearly a decade working in various capacities within the music industry, from artist management to independent label operations, began taking an active interest in formally shaping his younger brothers' careers. Terrence had spent much of his 20s bouncing between jobs in the industry, a stint at a small independent label in Atlanta, a brief attempt at managing a solo R&B artist who never quite broke through, work that gave him real, hard-won knowledge of how the business actually functioned, but had not yet delivered him the kind of success he had been chasing since he first left Memphis. Those who knew Terrence during this period described someone sharp, capable, and increasingly frustrated by an industry that seemed to keep rewarding other people's instincts over his own, a frustration that several people close to the family have since said, in hindsight, may have shaped decisions he made once his brother's success finally gave him the platform he had been waiting for. He approached Marcus and Malcolm with an offer that felt, at the time, like an obvious and generous solution to a problem they had not yet fully understood they had. That talent alone rarely translates into a sustainable career, without someone experienced enough to navigate contracts, bookings, and the business machinery surrounding the music itself. Terrence proposed managing the twins formally, taking a standard industry percentage of their earnings in exchange for handling every aspect of the business side, freeing Marcus and Malcolm to focus entirely on writing, performing, and developing their sound. Neither twin hesitated. Terrence was family, someone they had trusted their entire lives, someone who had already proven his commitment to their success by spending years introducing them to contacts, arranging early studio time, and covering costs out of his own pocket during periods when the twins had no independent income of their own. The arrangement was formalized with a written management agreement, though those close to the family have since noted that the actual terms were discussed casually, over kitchen table conversations, rather than extensive legal negotiation, reflecting a level of trust between the brothers that none of them saw any reason to question at the time. Malcolm has since said that even raising the idea of a lawyer reviewing the agreement independently would have felt, at 17 years old, like an insult to a brother who had never given either of them a reason to doubt him. Under Terrence's management, the twins, performing under the stage name Bloodline, released their first independent single roughly 8 months after graduating high school, a song called Same Blood that built modestly on local Memphis radio before catching wider regional attention through word of mouth and a handful of strategically placed performances at industry showcases. Terrence had arranged. Within a year, Bloodline had signed a recording contract with a mid-sized label based out of Atlanta, a deal Terrence negotiated on their behalf, one that gave the twins meaningful creative control over their music in exchange for a royalty structure that, on paper, appeared standard for artists at their stage of development. Terrence handled every round of negotiation personally, presenting Marcus and Malcolm with a final summary of terms, rather than the full contract language itself, a practice he framed at the time as simply sparing his brothers from paperwork. Neither of them had any real interest in wading through a framing. Neither twin questioned given how much they trusted him. The next several years unfolded in a blur of rapid, genuine success. Bloodline's debut album went platinum within its first year, driven by 2 singles that dominated radio airplay across the country and established the twins as one of the most exciting new acts in R&B and hip-hop crossover music. Marcus has described the night the debut single first hit the top 10 on the national charts as one of the strangest, most disorienting moments of his life. Standing in a cramped Atlanta apartment, he and Malcolm still shared at the time, watching the chart update on a laptop screen, unable to fully process that the song they had written together on that same secondhand keyboard from their childhood bedroom was now being heard by millions of strangers at the exact same moment. Their second album, released roughly 18 months later, performed even better commercially, anchored by a lead single that became something close to a cultural moment, played at weddings, graduations, and family cookouts across the country in a way that transcended typical chart success and settled into something more permanent in the culture. The tour supporting that album sold out venues in every major market within days, and Bloodline found themselves, almost faster than either twin could fully absorb, transformed from 2 brothers who had been recording demos on a borrowed cassette player only a few years earlier into genuine national celebrities, recognized on the street in cities they had never previously visited. By their third release, Bloodline had become a genuine national phenomenon, headlining arena tours, collaborating with some of the biggest names in the industry, and building a devoted fan base that spanned generations, from teenagers discovering them through the radio to older listeners drawn to the gospel-influenced harmonies that trace directly back to their mother's church choir. Loretta Reese has said watching her sons perform their biggest hit to a sold-out arena, a song whose bridge borrowed directly from a hymn she had taught the church choir decades earlier, remains one of the proudest moments of her life. A full circle she never could have imagined, sitting in that small church on the south side of Memphis. That same tour brought Bloodline back to Memphis for a hometown show that both twins have separately described as the single most emotional performance of their careers, playing to a sold-out arena, less than 15 minutes from the street where they grew up. Their parents seated in the front row, their father, by then retired from the warehouse, openly crying through the entire final song. Marcus has said that night crystallized something for him about why the business side of things had never interested him. That the entire point, as far as he was concerned, had always been this exact feeling, standing on a stage built from nothing but 2 brothers and a shared bedroom, watching it come full circle in the city that made them. It is a memory both twins have returned to often in the years since, a reminder of what the partnership meant before money complicated it. Throughout this period, Terrence remained the sole architect of the business side of Bloodline's operation, managing royalty distributions, licensing deals, merchandise arrangements, and the increasingly complex financial machinery that came with the group's growing success. He expanded his role considerably as the group's fame grew, eventually building out a small team under his direction, an accountant, a booking coordinator, and a legal liaison who handled contract details, though all of them, by every account from that period, reported directly and exclusively to Terrence, rather than to Marcus or Malcolm themselves. This structure, which felt like simple efficiency at the time, meant that virtually every financial detail of Bloodline's operation passed through Terrence's hands before either twin ever saw a summary of it. Marcus and Malcolm, by their own later admission, remained almost entirely disengaged from the financial details of their own career during these peak years, trusting Terrence completely, focused instead on the creative work that had always been the actual reason either of them wanted to do this in the first place. Malcolm has said he could not have told you, during those years, the precise royalty percentage attached to their recording contract, or the specific structure of how touring revenue was split and distributed. Details he assumed, without much thought, were being handled correctly by the one person in the family with the expertise and the responsibility to handle them. Marcus has echoed this, describing a period where he would simply sign whatever documents Terrence placed in front of him during quick conversations backstage or between studio sessions, trusting the relationship more than he ever scrutinized the paperwork. Friends and industry colleagues from that era described the Reese family during this period as the picture of a hard-working, tightly bonded success story. Three brothers building something extraordinary together, each contributing exactly what they were suited to contribute. Terrence, for his part, cultivated a public image as the steady hand behind the group's business success, giving interviews about artist management and industry strategy that positioned him as a rising figure in his own right within the business side of the music industry, a reputation that grew alongside Bloodline's own fame. He was frequently profiled in industry trade publications as an example of family management done right, a narrative that, in hindsight, several people close to the situation have said always felt slightly more curated than the reality underneath it, though none of them had reason at the time to suspect anything beyond an older brother enjoying deserved recognition for his role in his siblings' success. By their fourth album, released nearly 6 years after their debut, Bloodline had become one of the most commercially successful R&B duos of their generation, with total career earnings that industry estimates placed well into 8 figures. Marcus purchased a large home outside Memphis for their parents, a gift both twins have said meant more to them than any award the group ever received, watching their mother walk through rooms larger than she had ever imagined living in, still humming hymns under her breath as she moved from room to room. Malcolm invested in a series of business ventures, unrelated to music, quietly building a financial foundation he hoped would outlast his performing career. An instinct toward caution that friends have said set him apart from many artists at his level of fame who spent as quickly as they earned. On the surface, and for a remarkably long time beneath it as well, everything about the Reese family's story looked like exactly what it appeared to be, a rare example of family and business succeeding together, without the tension that so often destroys partnerships built on both blood and money at the same time. Industry veterans who had watched countless family-managed acts implode over exactly these dynamics frequently cited Bloodline as the exception, the rare case where blood and business genuinely seemed to strengthen each other, rather than eventually pulling apart under the weight of money and mistrust. Life on the road during those peak years took on a rhythm all its own, one that further deepened the twins' reliance on Terrence's management of everything happening offstage. Tour managers and crew members from that era describe Marcus and Malcolm as remarkably hands-off when it came to logistics, trusting the team Terrence had assembled to handle everything from hotel bookings to merchandise inventory, freeing the twins to focus entirely on the 2 hours a night they spent actually performing. One longtime sound engineer who worked with Bloodline across 3 separate tours has said the twins were, in his experience, unusually uninterested in the business side of their own success compared to most artists at their level, an observation he offered without judgment at the time, but has since reconsidered in light of everything that eventually came out. There was, however, one small moment from this period that several people close to the family have pointed to since as an early, easily missed sign of tension beneath the surface. During a family gathering at their parents' new home roughly 5 years into Bloodline's career, a cousin who had recently started her own small business asked Terrence a casual question about how royalty splits typically worked in the music industry, curious given her proximity to the family's success. Several relatives who were present that day have described Terrence's response as unusually short and dismissive for someone who normally enjoyed discussing his professional expertise at length, redirecting the conversation quickly toward an unrelated topic in a way that struck at least 2 people in the room as slightly odd, though nobody thought much of it again until years later, when the same question, asked far more formally by lawyers rather than curious relatives, would receive a very different kind of response. Malcolm has also since reflected on smaller moments from this period that carried more weight in hindsight than they did at the time. Evenings when Terrence would arrive at family dinners, visibly stressed about business matters, he described only in vague terms, or brief flashes of irritation when either twin asked even mild questions about upcoming financial decisions, irritation that Terrence would typically smooth over quickly, with reassurances that he had everything under control and that the twins' only job was to keep making great music. Malcolm has said he genuinely believed that reassurance for years, not because he was naive, but because Terrence had never once given either of them concrete reason to doubt it, and because questioning it felt, in the context of everything their family had built together, almost unimaginable. It was during the preparation for Bloodline's fifth studio album, nearly 7 years into their career, that the first small cracks began to appear, cracks that neither twin fully understood the significance of at the time. Marcus, working with an independent accountant on an unrelated personal investment, a small apartment complex he was considering purchasing outside Memphis, found himself needing to provide documentation of his music royalty income for a loan application, a routine request that led him, almost by accident, to request a detailed breakdown of Bloodline's earnings directly from the label rather than through Terrence's usual summary reports. The label's accounting department, somewhat surprised by the direct request given that all prior communication on financial matters had come exclusively through Terrence's office, took nearly 3 weeks to compile and send over the full breakdown. When it finally arrived, Marcus sat with it on a Sunday afternoon, initially just skimming for the total figures his independent accountant needed for the loan paperwork, not looking closely enough at the underlying numbers to notice anything unusual. It was his accountant, reviewing the same documents a few days later, who first flagged that the royalty rate reflected in the label's own records did not match the rate Marcus recalled. Terrence, citing in casual conversations over the years, a discrepancy of a few percentage points that, on an operation generating the kind of revenue Bloodline generated, translated into a genuinely significant sum of money over time. Marcus initially dismissed the concern, assuming his own memory of casual conversations from years earlier was simply less precise than an actual signed contract, and asked his accountant to pull the original recording agreement to settle the question definitively. It took another 2 weeks to track down a complete copy of the contract, since Terrence's office initially provided only a partial document, citing difficulty locating the full original file, a delay that in hindsight would take on a different significance, but that felt, at the time, like nothing more than ordinary administrative friction. When the complete contract finally arrived, and Marcus's accountant walked him through it line by line, the royalty percentage written into the actual signed agreement was measurably higher than what Terrence had been reporting to Marcus and Malcolm as their earnings rate for years. Marcus mentioned the discrepancy to Malcolm almost casually at first, framing it as probably just a difference in reporting periods or accounting methods between the label and Terrence's internal tracking, the kind of minor inconsistency neither of them expected to amount to anything once someone actually sat down and reconciled the numbers properly. He remembers sitting with Malcolm in a hotel room during a tour stop in Charlotte, laptop open between them, walking through the numbers together, both of them initially more curious than concerned, treating it as a puzzle to solve rather than the first thread of something much larger. Malcolm, characteristically trusting, suggested they simply ask Terrence directly to walk them through it, certain there was a reasonable explanation waiting on the other side of that conversation, some accounting nuance. Neither twin had the financial background to fully understand on their own. What neither of them anticipated was how Terrence would respond when they finally raised the question. Rather than the straightforward explanation both brothers expected, Terrence grew visibly uncomfortable. According to Marcus's later account, deflecting the specifics of the question with vague references to complicated industry accounting practices and promising to have his own accountant prepare a full reconciliation, a promise that, in the weeks that followed, repeatedly failed to materialize despite multiple follow-up requests from both twins. That evasiveness, more than the original numerical discrepancy itself, was what finally convinced Marcus and Malcolm that something beyond a simple bookkeeping error might be sitting underneath the question they had asked, a suspicion neither of them wanted to fully entertain, but that neither of them could any longer fully dismiss, either. What Marcus and Malcolm discovered when they finally pushed past Terrence's evasive answers and demanded a full accounting, and what it cost them to learn the complete truth, is where part 2 of this story begins. Was the discrepancy Marcus found simply the tip of something far larger? Or was there still an innocent explanation waiting for them? one that could preserve the trust three brothers had built their entire lives and careers around. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened behind the scenes at Bloodline. And subscribe so you don't miss part 2, where the truth Marcus and Malcolm uncovered changes everything about how they understood their own family.